The origins of the big bad thing from 2020 is, for some reason, still contested to this day, 6 years later. It is easy for people that have not looked into the situation to think that the fact that a lab studying the same family of viruses in the same city where that virus later emerged is enough of a coincidence to explain what happened. That and the lack of trust in the CCP to actually provide real data and information. I don't blame you if that is you. Who the hell wants to read papers about molecular epidemiology or learn about furin cleavage sites in their free time? I do, however, blame the irresponsible pricks who these people spend their valuable time listening to. People who do no research whatsoever and imply that anyone who thinks that a natural spillover is a plausible explanation is lying to you out of a need to be politically correct, or even worse, a shill for the CCP. Simply for having the audacity to actually trust scientists, peer-reviewed papers, and history. They have a responsibility to their audience to at least look into what they're talking about. If people are giving you their time, value it. Please know that from the bottom of my heart, I don't give a shit where it came from. If it turns out that it did come from a lab, I couldn't care less, and would have no problem believing it. I would like to point out that the idea that it came from the Chinese eating diseased exotic animals kept in poor conditions also doesn't look good for them either. Regardless of the actual origin, I just want to know the truth, and I want you to know the truth. With all that being said, I will be providing you with the strongest available evidence that the virus was actually caused by sick animals, trapped in cages, possibly with broken legs or bullet wounds, that were then taken into people's homes to be killed and eaten. To start, I will quickly address the possibility that there is evidence within the virus itself that points to a lab leak hypothesis. There was something discovered in the earliest strains of the virus that some thought might have suggested that SARS-CoV-2, or as you know it, COVID-19, was genetically engineered. This was the furin cleavage site, or FCS. It is a relatively common mutation, but in SARS-CoV-2, it is located on a particular protein that allows for the virus to be primed before leaving the host cell. This means that it is able to infect a new cell as soon as it leaves the host. If you wanted to make a virus spread quickly, you would want this included. It was later discovered, however, that the act of priming that protein increases the likelihood that the virus would lose the component required for it to latch onto a new cell. So while it is able to infect cells faster, the longer that it is outside of the host cell, the greater the likelihood that it will become useless. This flaw was corrected in a later mutation within a few months, which ensured that that component stayed attached to the virus for longer while allowing the virus to also be primed while leaving the host cell. So the original mutation only temporarily boosted transmission. After a while, its kill switch would turn on, and it would stop itself from being able to spread. The fact that this mutation had such a flaw, and that it was corrected relatively early in the evolution of the virus, means that it most likely was not engineered. The FCS is also found in many other variants of beta coronavirus, ones that aren't part of the SARS-CoV-2 line, so it wouldn't even be particularly surprising to find it in COVID-19. The Wuhan lab in question was studying coronavirus. It had even discovered a bat-based coronavirus that had a 96.2 genetic match to SARS-CoV-2. The issue was that COVID-19 was different from that version by over 1,000 mutations. Going off of the rate of mutation in coronavirus, this would mean that the coronavirus in the lab and the earliest version of COVID-19 split from each other anywhere between 20 to 72 years ago. As for the evidence that we have for it being a transmission from an animal to a human in a wet market, there have been 7 instances of coronavirus spilling over from animals to humans. The virus source animals were rodents twice and bats 5 times. Each time, the virus was transferred through an intermediate species. Those animals included alpacas, camels, cattle, civets, and raccoon dogs. This wouldn't even be the first time that there has been a spread from an intermediate species to humans in a wet market in China. In 2002, the original SARS-CoV virus was transmitted between civets and raccoon dogs to people. So we know that it is possible, and dare I say common, for viruses in the same family of COVID-19 to spread from animals to people. The paper titled "The Hunan Seafood Wholesale Wet Market in Wuhan Was the Early Epicenter of the COVID-19 Pandemic," published in Science in 2022, used patient data from early on in the pandemic to determine the most likely location for the origins of the outbreak. Using patient homes, they were able to determine that the most densely populated area of sickness was centered around the Hunan seafood market. The fact that most of these recorded sicknesses happened near the market is a good indicator, but that in and of itself isn't enough. When they removed patients that had a direct link to the wet market, the geospatial plot of patients left in December at the start of the pandemic showed a very close proximity to the market. This means that people that had no affiliation to the market had a higher chance of catching the virus simply due to the proximity to it. And the patients that lived farther away early on had a high likelihood of having a direct link to the market. The only way to read this data is that the market itself was the source of the infection. By January 2020, 66% of the hospitalized patients had direct exposure to the Hunan wet market. I would point out at this time that the lab in Wuhan is 30 minutes away from the market. It isn't a street or two away. There is no way that the virus epicenter was the lab. If you can agree that the data collected is accurate and that the locations that the patients gave for their homes is true, you must agree that the market is the source. The data was being gathered by multiple hospitals early on when they thought it was only a pneumonia outbreak. There was no sense that a pandemic of the scale that would occur was happening. If you grant that the market was the source, it means the accidental release from the lab is very unlikely. Even if a scientist became infected and went straight to that market, there would be a statistically significant amount of patients coming from wherever the scientist would have lived and visited when they weren't showing signs of infection. There is another component to this which makes this hypothetical almost impossible, and I will elaborate on it later. So this leaves two options. It was created and spread on purpose, or it happened via spreading from an animal at the wet market naturally. If this was a purposefully spread virus, this particular wet market wouldn't even make sense because it isn't even a popular market. There were 70 more popular markets in the city. Using social media data, it was discovered that the Hunan wet market accounted for 120 of 98,146 total social media check-ins over the observed time, meaning that only 0.12% of all market goers were going to that specific market on any given day. While it is a low-traffic market compared to the 70 other in the city, it is the market with the largest number of vendors selling live animals, meaning that if an outbreak caused by the natural transmission between animals to humans was going to happen, it was most likely going to happen there. If there was a clandestine cause to all of this, it would make much more sense to choose any of the markets that had way more visitors. With the realization that the market was the center to all of this, the team then got to work trying to determine where in the market was the most likely origin. They were able to establish an overlap between COVID-19 found on a gate and water drainage that mapped over the location of a vendor that had been known to sell live raccoon dogs, red foxes, and hog badgers up until the pandemic. That suggested that those animals were most likely infected. Unfortunately, there were no live animals present at the time that the team was able to go to the market, as their sale was prohibited at that time. However, there have been other papers that have established with photographic evidence that these specific stalls had these animals for sale at the time of the pandemic. There is a substantial network of wildlife farms in Hubei province that have provided hundreds of thousands of civets, ferret badgers, and raccoon dogs to live markets, including the Hunan wet market. This region has extensive cave networks that house bats that have historically carried COVID. The first outbreak of COVID in China that occurred in 2002 was from civet farms in this area. The market that it spread from had stayed open for over half a year after the first human case. This resulted in many tests of live animals that ended up positive from both the farm and the market. There is a chance that SARS-CoV-2 originated from the same population of bats that infected those civets in 2002. Unlike the first time around, animals on those farms were released or killed in 2020 without testing for COVID, as were the animals at the wet market. This time around, we apparently have no tests from live animals. So remember earlier when I said that I would go over something that further makes accidental spread from a lab nearly impossible? Well, in the 2022 paper, The Molecular Epidemiology of Multiple Zoonotic Origins of SARS-CoV-2, also published in Science, they discovered that there were actually two distinct originating lineages of COVID-19. They were denoted Lineage A and B. Lineage B was discovered in patients on December 24th and 26th of 2019, and Lineage A was discovered in patients on December 30th, 2019, and January 5th, 2020. Lineage A is more closely related to the coronavirus that is seen in bats, which at the time suggested that lineage A was the older of the two. At the time that this study was published, no known sample of lineage A was found at the market itself, which led the team to question whether it also originated at the market. They came to the conclusion that it did in their own way. A year after this paper was published, it was announced that one of the samples from the market taken in 2020 was in fact a lineage A sample. This retroactively strengthened the conclusion that the article came to. So even though they had no data to suggest that A was at the market, it was found in people that had lived near or recently visited the market. There was no transitional sample of COVID discovered between A and B, which had at first suggested that the transition happened inside of humans. The major questions were, if A is more closely related to the coronavirus found in bats, suggesting it was the older lineage, why was B discovered first? And why was the B strain so much more prolific? The answer is that COVID jumped from animals to humans twice. Both lineage A and lineage B was brought to the market in two separate animals or groups of animals, and then each infected separate people. The assumption that the mutation between A and B happened inside humans was incorrect. The team created a model for the theoretical recent common ancestor of lineage A and B. This allowed them to determine how each lineage emerged. Lineage B had certain evolutionary forks that would mean the divergence between it and A would have had to have happened long before either entered humans. B was more complex than A. This suggests that it might have spent a longer time evolving in the intermediate species. That insight doesn't suggest that the intermediate species was infected twice, simply that lineage A and B were present in the intermediate species, and B changed more than A in the same amount of time. It was also found to be highly unlikely that B would have evolved from A. They existed simultaneously within the intermediate species and shared a common ancestry, but one did not come from the other. Just like you didn't evolve from monkeys, you evolved alongside them. They then tested pandemic models with the assumption that there was a single transfer that forked into two, and a model where it jumped twice. The model with a single transmission that evolved into two lineages within humans was not able to replicate the spread pattern of both lineages that we saw in the real pandemic. The model only matched the real-world outcome when there were two separate transmissions, further suggesting that the most recent common ancestor to both was not found in humans. Throughout all the tests, consistently, lineage B was more fit and wider spreading. It is rare that the first actual case of a disease is the same as the first reported case. With that being said, the first known case of SARS-CoV-2 was a fish seller in Hunan Market. He presented symptoms on December 10th and was hospitalized on December 16th of 2019. His genome wasn't sequenced, so there was no confirmation of which lineage he had, but it is assumed that it was lineage B due to it being discovered in his stall. The first confirmed lineage A patient displayed symptoms on December 15th and was hospitalized on December 25th. Based on the lifespan of COVID-19 and patients appearing with symptoms, it was calculated that the earliest possible lineage B infection was most likely around November 18th, and the earliest A infection was November 25th. This was also confirmed by a test of tens of thousands of blood samples given up till December, which showed no presence of the virus. According to a preprint paper titled COVID-19 Origins, Quantifying Scientific Consensus Amid Political Polarization Through Mixed Method Meta-Analysis, released this year, warning, this has not been peer-reviewed, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, 84% of papers that explicitly supported one side or the other supported the natural transmission from live animals. They selected 699 papers for the quantitative analysis, 588 of which explicitly side with the natural transmission hypothesis. Strains of coronavirus found in bats in Laos had a 96.8 and 96.2% match to the genomes of SARS-CoV-2. There were also strains found in horseshoe bats in Yunnan province in China which showed a 96.2% match. Notice that none of the evidence that I have provided would change depending on whether the Wuhan lab was conducting gain-of-function research. They could have, but what they were testing it on would not have become COVID-19. I have shown you that natural transmission from bats to an intermediate species to humans has happened multiple times. I have shown you that the specific scenario of it happening at a market that sells live animals in China has also already happened, and that the bats and farms responsible for the last outbreak were also possibly involved in this one. I have shown that the geospatial data of patients' homes of the early outbreak before it was known what was happening centered around the Hunan market, and that there is no evidence that the virus was genetically engineered. that the virus actually jumped from an intermediate species to humans in 2 separate instances, and that it must have been circulating in that intermediate population for a long time to have split into such distinct lineages. If you do not trust this information, I have nothing for you. Nothing I say can change your mind. No one can provide you any information to change the feeling that you have that it started in a lab. You just have a fundamental mistrust of science that I cannot overcome. All I can say is that the scientific community has provided genetic, geographical, and historical evidence to back up their claim, whereas the lab leak believers have provided no evidence and simply rely on the mistrust of institutions and the Chinese as their source. It is rather clear to me which side has a more concrete argument. I say again that even if the natural spillover is the source of all of this, it isn't a particularly favorable story for the CCP to have to tell. I hope this has provided a clear enough understanding of the current scientific consensus on the cause of the 2019 pandemic. There will be more. Please do not let your mistrust of this one affect what you believe about the next one. Hindsight is 20/20, and even if you are of the opinion that it wasn't that bad, many people died. Early strains of COVID were 10 to 20 more times deadly than the flu. We didn't know how bad things were when it was happening. The understanding of things change over time with new data. When you hear scientists talk about things that are being worked on day by day as they happen, they will change their prescriptions. No one is omniscient. Understand that they are going off of the most likely accurate information. Science doesn't operate as a binary where things are either true or not. It's a percentage game. There is always room for error, and when you need to release information by the day or week, things are likely to change. I implore you to not use this as a reason to mistrust the data or science. The advancements of the mRNA vaccine technology during the pandemic was a monumental achievement. They work by introducing your cells to the component that SARS-CoV-2 uses to attach to the cell, the component that would fall off after an amount of time as a result of the FCS mutation that was later improved with future mutations. Once your cells know that it is a hostile protein, they can develop white blood cells that can fight it off in the future. Instead of needing to introduce a whole, dead, or weakened virus, now we only need to introduce them to a harmless subcomponent that the virus needs to spread. We can also relatively easily modify that protein for future viruses. According to Risk of Blood Clots After COVID-19 Vaccination and Infection, a risk-benefit analysis, another pre-released paper, so grain of salt and all, the mRNA vaccine does slightly increase the chance of you getting a blood clot. However, COVID itself significantly increases the chance that you'll get a clot, and the vaccine reduces the chance that SARS-CoV-2 related clots will occur. So if you get the vaccine and you never get the virus, you have slightly increased the chances that you'll get one. But if you do get the virus after the fact, you have overall reduced the likelihood that you will get a clot. So if you get the jab and at any point after the fact got COVID-19, congratulations, you have reduced the likelihood of getting a blood clot. As of writing, COVID-19 has killed over 7 million people. The opinion that it wasn't a dangerous virus does a disservice to the men, women, and children that died. Your actions during the next pandemic, whenever that happens, will have real consequences on yourself and your loved ones. There are those watching this with anger about what happened. They think that the world overreacted. They think to themselves that the next time this happens, they will resist, and that they will refuse to be sheep. I cannot say that I know what should have happened. And I cannot say that what did happen wasn't an overreaction. But what I can say is that this was the biggest outbreak since the Spanish flu of 1918. The Spanish flu killed 3 to 4 times the amount of people that died in World War I and in half the time. No one at the time knew what was going to happen or how many people were going to die as a result of what was happening. And back then, there was no defense against it. It was too effective at killing its host and was hurting its own survivability. You see, it isn't the goal of a virus to kill the host. If it does, then they won't be around to infect again next year. So they tend to come in hot and mellow out once the population builds an immunity. The Spanish flu is still with us today. Now it's just one of the many seasonal flus that comes and goes every once in a while, just as COVID has become. The pandemic that terrorized our great-grandparents is still hunting us, just as COVID-19 will most likely be hunting our great-grandchildren. Our species has a short memory. We tend to only remember the things that happen directly to us and have to relearn the lessons of our forebears. Our institutions exist to preserve those lessons. They are there to remind us of the dangers that lurk in the dark. we should be bolstering and reimagining them to serve us better. They are the only vestige of the generations before that experienced true horrors. They are their final gift to us. Weapons to fight the monsters, should they ever return.